Okay guys, I'm back. We're continuing section 13-4, graphing the sine function, page 737 this time. This is example 5 and example 6. We're going to actually graph some sine functions and see how to graph them and what to do step by step in graphing these. To graph them, we're not going to need to make a table of values. We're just going to graph them the way I show you now, the step method. It should be pretty simple. If you understand what the period is and what the amplitude is, those are going to help you to graph the sine function. So in example 5, page 737a, again, you should be copying these notes down. Again, you can always pause and copy, so that's why I'm going fast. It says here, graph one cycle of a sine curve with an amplitude of 2 and a period of 4 pi. Well, this is what it tells me. Step 1, amplitude of 2 tells me that the maximum and minimum points will be 2 and negative 2. Because remember, the amplitude is half the distance from the max to the min. So if the amplitude is 2, the maximum is going to be at 2, and the minimum is going to be at negative 2, and the middle will be at 0. The midline is the x-axis. It's important to understand what the midline is. So now that I have that, amplitude is 2, tells me the max and min are going to be 2 and negative 2. A period of 4 pi tells me that the whole graph is going to, one cycle of the graph is going to go from 0 to 4 pi. It's going to be 4 pi units wide. That's horizontal length. So from 0 to 4 pi is a period of 4 pi. That means one cycle, that one loop, is going to be from 0 to 4 pi. That's what the period tells me. Again, the amplitude tells me the maximum and minimum points. And the amplitude is 2, so it's going to be, the top is going to be 2, the maximum, and the minimum is going to be negative 2. Again, the amplitude is the distance from the midline to the top, to the maximum, or the distance from the midline to the minimum. Again, both are 2. Now that I know all that stuff, how are we going to actually graph this sine function? Well, step 1 says the amplitude is 2. We already got that. Step 2 says the period is 4 pi. What we want to do, when we know what the period is, we're going to always divide it by 4. Always divide the period by 4 equal parts. Again, you start at the midline. There's going to be a maximum, midline again, minimum, and then back to the midline again. The midline, this case, is the x-axis. It's almost always the x-axis until we get into later sections. Okay, so when we divide 4 pi by 4, look what we get. We get pi. What that tells me is each major unit is going to be pi. 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi. We had 0 to 4 pi was the one cycle. And then what we did was we divided it by 4 to find out what my 4 main sections are going to be. These one cycle has 4 main sections. Now that we have that, again, sine always starts at the midline at 0. Since it's positive, we're going to go, the amplitude is positive, we're going to go up. Since it's positive, we're going to go up. If it was negative, we would go down, then back up, then back down. Since it's positive, we're going to start at the midline and go up. So here are the 4 sections that we divided it into. Pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, because we divided the period 4 pi by 4 to get these sections. That means we're going to divide it into pi sections. Each section is a pi long. Pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi. Okay, graphing it is very simple. The first section is the maximum. The first of these pi's is the maximum, so I put it down up here at 2. And again, I went from 2 to negative 2 because the amplitude was 2. It's going to go up to 2 and down to negative 2. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go up. The first section is the maximum, pi. The second section is going to be the x-intercept, the midline intersect. And again, it's going to be curvy, so it's going to cross at 2 pi. Then the third section is going to be the minimum point. At 3 pi is the minimum point, and again, at negative 2 is 3 pi. See, we don't need a table. And last but not least is going to be the x-intercept again of 4 pi. This graph goes on forever in both directions, by the way, but we only want to graph it from 0 to 4 pi. That's one cycle from 0 to 4 pi, but it does keep going forever. This is a periodic function. That's how you graph the sine function. So sine always starts at the midline. If sine is positive, it goes up. If it's negative, it goes down. So it was positive, so I went up. Since it's positive, I went up from the midline as the origin. Okay, B says, write the equation of the graph in this form. A sine of B theta. A is the amplitude. B is the period. It's not the period, it's B. B is the number of cycles from 0 to 2 pi. Again, B is, let me say that again. B is the number of cycles from 0 to 2 pi. That's important. How many cycles do we have from 0 to 2 pi here? If this is a whole cycle, how many cycles from 0 to 4 pi? How many cycles do we have from 0 to 2 pi? Think about that. Again, the whole cycle goes from 0 to 4 pi. How many? B is the number of cycles from 0 to 2 pi. How many cycles do we have from 0 to 2 pi? Let's go ahead and find it algebraically, and we'll come back to this graph in a minute. Algebraically, let's find, well, the amplitude is fairly simple. The amplitude we said was 2, so A is 2. A equals 2. So we have that already. What we need now is so we're going to go y equals, we know A is 2, sine, we need to find what B is. B theta, and theta is a variable. It's like the x variable. So we need to find what B is. Once we find what B is, we're done. To find B, we know period equals 2 pi over B. Remember that formula we learned about? We know the period. The period was 4 pi. It was given to us. The period is given to us at 4 pi. So I'm going to replace period with 4 pi, and then the 4 pi period equals 2 pi over B. We're going to solve for B. To solve for B, you can multiply both sides by B. The B's cancel out on this side. You get B 4 pi equals 2 pi. Divide both sides by 4 pi. And what do you get? Pi and pi cancel out. Here you get the 4 pi's cancel out. You got B equals, everybody see what I'm doing here? The 4 pi's cancel out because I divided both sides by 4 pi. I'm solving for B. I'm trying to find out what B is. Once I find out what B is, I have my equation. Well, all we got to do, the pi's canceled out here. 2 divided by 4 is what? 1/2. B is 1/2. Let's go back here. Remember I told you that B stands for the number of cycles from 0 to 2 pi? Well, let's see why it's 1/2. If this is a whole cycle from 0 to 4 pi, then from 0 to 2 pi in this function happens to be a half a cycle. This is a half a cycle. Yeah, it makes sense. B is 1/2. There's your equation. So put 1/2 in for B. Keep theta, keep y where it's at. A is 2. B is 1/2. So I replaced A with 2, B with 1/2. Here's the equation. Let me highlight that for you. There's the answer. This is the equation of that graph we just graphed. Okay, now what I want you to do is quick check number 5, page 737, A, B, and C. You can do that on your own. Right now, I'm going to go to example 6, page 737. We're going to sketch one cycle. Now, we're given the equation and we're told to sketch it. Well, we know this for sure. We know that y equals A sine of B theta. So we know that A equals 1/2 and B equals 2. We're gonna need that to find the amplitude and the period in order to graph this. So let's go over here. The amplitude is the absolute value of A, which is 1/2. It's positive, so it's gonna start at the midline and go up. We're starting at 0, 0, and we're gonna go up. Let me do this in red. We're gonna start at 0, 0, and we're gonna go up. Up, why? Because the equation is positive. It's positive 1/2 sine of 2 theta. So we know the amplitude is 1/2. Therefore, that's why I have 1/2 and negative 1/2 as my max and min this time. Because the amplitude tells you the max and min. So 1/2 and negative 1/2 are my max and min. Now what I need is the period. B is 2. If we know what B is, the formula for period is 2 pi over B. B is the number of cycles from 0 to 2 pi. So it happens to be 2. There's 2 cycles from 0 to 2 pi. Okay, so let's find the period then. Replace B with 2. B is 2, replace B with 2, 2 pi over 2 equals pi. The whole period is pi. What we need to graph it is once we find the period, we're always going to divide the period by 4 equal parts. So divide pi by 4, what do you get? You get pi over 4. So keep adding pi over 4 to figure out all the different 4 sections. So pi over 4 is the first section. Add pi over 4 to that, you get 2 pi over 4. Add pi over 4 to that, you get 3 pi over 4. Add pi over 4 to that, you get 4 pi over 4. I kept adding pi over 4. Again, this is still from 0, pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, and 4 pi over 4 is pi. We're going from 0 to pi still, 0 to pi. So let's reduce all of these that we got so we can list them on my graph. Again, we know the amplitude's 1/2, so 1/2 to negative 1/2 are going to be my max and min. And we know it's a sine function, so we're going to start at the midline. Okay? And we know it's going to be a curvy line. So let's go ahead and reduce all these fractions to see what we got. Pi over 4, we can't be reduced, pi over 4. 2 pi over 4 is the same as pi over 2. We can reduce it to pi over 2. 3 pi over 4 can't be reduced, so 3 pi over 4. 4 pi over 4 can be reduced to pi. Again, from 0 to pi is going to be my period. So I'm going to graph one period of this sine function. Again, we're going to start at 0 and we're going to go up because it was positive. If it was negative, I would start at 0 and go down. And then these four sections, pi over 4, pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and pi, we got from B. We found the period. Once we found the period, we divided the period by 4. To find these four sections in the sine graph, you always divide the period by 4 to figure these out. And we did that, and we got pi over 4. That meant these four sections were going to be pi over 4 units away from each other. So we kept adding pi over 4 to them. Again, I'm saying the same thing I just talked about earlier. Now, this is the midpoint. I'm going to go up. So the maximum is going to be at pi over 4, which is going to be 1/2. Then we're going to cross the x-axis at the next section, which is pi over 2. Then the minimum is going to be the next section, which is going to be negative 1/2, which is going to be 3 pi over 4. And the next section is going to go back to the x-axis, which is going to be pi. Let me go ahead and graph that. Again, it's positive, so I'm going to go up and down, up, down. Again, this goes on forever in both directions. So I'm going to put arrows, but we want it to graph from 0 to pi, one cycle only. Sketch one cycle. This is one cycle, but again, this goes on forever in both directions, to the right and to the left. But we just graphed one cycle from 0 to pi. That's one cycle. Again, now that you know how to do that, I want you to try to do quick check number 6, page 737, A and B. Here's A, here's B. Go ahead and do them, graph them the same way I graphed example 6. Your homework will be, let me see if you can see that. Your homework will be page 738, numbers 13 through 33 all. I'll let you know when it's due, when I actually post this on Google Classroom, and I'll let you know on Remind also when this homework is due. Again, this completes section 13-4. The next video is going to be 13-5. It's going to be extremely similar to this, except we're going to be graphing the cosine function. The difference is cosine always starts at the max or the min, but the graphs look identical, except instead of starting at the midpoint, they're going to start at the max or min, the cosine function. If it's positive, it'll start at the positive end of the maximum. If it's negative, it'll start at the minimum point. Okay? Thanks, guys. I'll be posting this soon.